So firstly, just quick introductions. My name's Christina Hingley. I am the EAL product owner here at Twinkl. What I'm going to talk about today is a mixture of Twinkl resources that can help support learners of EAL in science, alongside a lot of resources and material taken from my time as whole school EAL coordinator here in Sheffield. Working with secondary students. So it's again today's going to be a bit of a mixture of academic research, talking about the challenges of supporting learners of EAL alongside strategies and how we can approach planning for that. So in this session, we will cover the challenges facing learners of EAL in science. So broken this down into specific areas. So with a bit of a focus on vocabulary in particular, related to topic-specific vocab, subject specialised words and academic instructions, alongside two key skill areas that are very common when teaching science, so reading longer texts and also producing written pieces of work. Mixed in with this, we'll have strategies that we can use to support learners of EAL, and then at the very end I'd like to talk about something that's super important in terms of how to plan for those challenges. Helen, our EAL segment manager, is also on the call today. I've just popped a little meet the EAL team there for you all, just so that you can put some names to faces. That we're a lovely team that work here. I'm very, very, very enthusiastic in terms of supporting our learners of EAL. So firstly, I wanted to share with you some results from a survey that we did way back in 2022 with our users of EAL resources on Twinkl, where we were discussing which topics educators found most difficult to teach learners of EAL. And one that consistently came up was the teaching of science. So behind English, history and geography, science was the fourth most difficult subject to teach, and particularly for Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, it worked higher up in the number of people who said that it was the most difficult, the most challenging one. Obviously, we know that science is very much a subject that is full of lots of linguistic complexities, is very content heavy, very subject specific, and as the quote says here, students need to understand and use ever more complex language alongside increasing cognitive demands of subject knowledge. For our EAL learners who are going into science lessons, particularly those who are new to learning English, it's almost a bit of a double whammy, really. You have students who are learning the content, but then also the English language to be able to express the knowledge of that content on top of it. And so we need to bear that in mind when we are teaching, when we are approaching teaching our learners of EAL. So the first thing that I wanted to discuss, one of the main challenges facing learners of EAL, and I think this is one that you all agree on, is vocabulary. So I've broken this down into three specific areas. First of all, we're going to have a quick look at topic-specific vocabulary. So this refers to things that are specialised terms that are absolutely essential for understanding scientific concepts. And so I just put some examples on here. Photosynthesis, my spelling there is incorrect, electromagnetic and respiration. Now, the focus today, all of my examples that I've put together are photosynthesis related, just so that there's a common theme running through and we can see how we can build on that knowledge. So if you're wondering why there's lots of photosynthesis related things on there, it's, so that it's all consistent, I can show you how we can put the strategies in place. So a lot of the strategies and the research today can be found on various EAL support websites. So on our own Twinkl site, the Bell Foundation as well, some of you, I imagine some of you are very aware of, have lots of really useful guidance on there on how to support learners of EAL and science alongside NALDIC. So it's worth checking them out, and we will share links after the session. So the first point I wanted to make was that many technical terms in science, they come from Greek and Latin roots, and these can often pose challenges in terms of unfamiliar spellings and forms. The example that I've put there is how we can break down the word chlorophyll into two separate prefixes and suffixes, so chlora and phyll, and when you combine them together, it comes up with the idea of green leaf, but that's not exactly the definition of what chlorophyll is. So you know, initially that's a stumbling block if we break it down like that. Pronunciation can be a barrier for a lot of these words. I've put intricate syllable structures, they have phonetic patterns that diverge from common English words. And many of the technical terms, they're unfamiliar outside of the context of science. So, you know, if you were to use the word chlorophyll as the example outside of a scientific context, you know, we wouldn't really use it in our day-to-day everyday language. And even EAL learners with a higher English proficiency level, they might struggle with technical vocabulary due to its specialised nature. So that sort of you're looking at learners perhaps who are EAL code Cs, Ds, developing competency within the English language, who are needing less support within lessons. They will still find these terms difficult. So when we talk about topic-specific vocabulary in science, it's important to bear in mind that there are two types of vocabulary that we really need to think about. The first type of vocabulary is COV, so content obligatory vocabulary. These are the key terms and the concepts that are necessary for grasping the content of a topic. So in order for us to understand the subject, we need to have the knowledge of this vocabulary. We then build on that with content compatible vocabulary. So not necessarily essential for understanding the core content. These words, they complement, they go with that COV vocabulary. They provide additional context and connections. So an example that I've drawn up for you here is for our definition of photosynthesis. So during photosynthesis, plants use sunlight, chlorophyll, carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose, while also releasing oxygen as a byproduct. So our core COV word is photosynthesis. That's the topic that we're studying. That's what we need to, and that's the concept that we need to understand. However, when we dig a bit deeper into that definition, we realise that there's extra words in there, our content compatible vocabulary, that are also needed to be understood in order to get to understand the main topic of photosynthesis. So I've put those on the side there just as an example. We then dig even deeper into that. On those definitions of our CCV words, we also find additional CCV words that can be used to help understand and explain the process of photosynthesis. So what we've got to remember that when we're explaining a concept in science, it's not just a case of providing the name and say an image to go with it. We have to dig a little deeper in terms of the vocabulary that the student's going to need in order to understand that concept. And it's also worth bearing in mind as well how our main COV words have different forms and functions. So when I talk about word form here, I'm referring to the way that various grammatical structures, the forms that words can take within a sentence. So the example I've put on here of photosynthesis is how we can use photosynthesis as a noun, but then it can also be used as a verb, an adjective and an adverb, depending on the context of the sentence and where it's placed. And understanding how these word functions how the word functions differently as a noun, verb, adjective and adverb, it can be confusing, especially for learners who aren't familiar with the grammatical rules of English. And it's also a struggle to construct sentences using these at times, in terms of, you know, ensuring grammatical accuracy and coherence and knowing where to place those words. And alongside this, learning and memorising all of those different forms of our main COV language, it can be quite overwhelming, especially for those who are building their English vocabulary. But you know, having this breadth of vocabulary is important when it comes to completing more challenging tasks and more challenging reading activities, more challenging writing activities. So yes, when we are looking at approaching a topic and we're investigating the language that we're going to be introducing to our learners, it is important to think about how this concept word can be used in many different ways. The next area of vocabulary that learners often have difficulties with are subject specialised words. So when I talk about subject specialised words, I'm referring to words that have specific meanings within a field or discipline, but they diverge from everyday usage. So you know, they may have one use in every day-to-day language, but when it comes to science, they mean something very specific. So this, you know, can cause real confusion. If a learner has knowledge of one of these subject specialised words that they use on a day-to-day basis, that for them is their definition, and putting it into a different context, they instantly become confused. Can lead to misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and it may be necessary that you have to provide explicit instruction for accurate comprehension of these words. So again, I've come up with some examples of how these language like this might confuse learners of EAL. So my example sentence: photosynthesis is like a plant's breathing process. It uses light to turn carbon dioxide and water into food, releases oxygen through gas exchange. This fuels the plant's life and provides energy. So I put the examples on there of how this might be confusing. Food, in an everyday context, is something that we eat, something that is used for nutrition. Here in photosynthesis, the food is glucose, produced from light energy. The word energy in general can have multiple different meanings. Normally when we talk about energy, we might be talking about like power or electricity, whereas here it's talking about the chemical energy that's stored. Light, everyday meaning: light as in brightness. Ceiling lamp, it might be a lamp light. It might be light as in it's not very heavy. Exchange, in biology, this is the transfer of oxygen or carbon dioxide, whereas exchange can often mean to swap. You exchange something. And then I also put breathing as well on there. Everyday language, and breathing, inhaling and exhaling air, is often commonly seen as something that we do as humans, whereas here it's talking about that gas exchange. I have also highlighted as well fuel in that sentence, and I haven't put the example, but I highlighted that because here it's being used as a verb. So this fuels, so obviously it gives, whereas when we commonly think fuel, it's something that we put inside a car, and it's used as a noun in that sense. So I thought it would be quite nice for us to have a little bit of a go at recognizing how words like this can be confusing for our learners of EAL. So this is an example that was taken from when I was teaching several years ago, and I was doing my rounds and having a look for good practice on how to support learners of EAL, and this came up as a starter activity for one of my new to English, one of my new international arrival students, and I thought that this was something that might cause misconceptions. So I was wondering whether anyone wanted to pop their hand up or pop in the chat and explain how a question like this, where do we get energy from, how the use of subject specialised words within that might cause confusion. Sort of mainly having a look around, I think things like perhaps how the picture might be cause some misconception, or perhaps the word of energy. Helen, how might you misinterpret this?
Yeah, I'm looking at the
picture.
I'm looking at the picture, thinking about energy. Like they might be thinking energy for what? They might be thinking energy for like running, energy to create something. So yeah, definitely the picture and the vocabulary alongside it is definitely going to confuse.
Perfect. We've got some in the chat as well. Depending on the understanding, they may have different interpretation for the word energy. Exactly that. This is sort of where I felt that misconceptions might crop up. So where do we get energy from? The picture doesn't really relate to the word energy. There's no context, and what type of energy is it? It might be energy related to running, energy related to electricity. So this is why it's really important to bear in mind those subject specialised words, and to ensure that we are providing specific meanings for them. I just put there as well a quote from Frank Monaghan, who mentioned that studies have shown that students are more likely to opt for the most common familiar meaning of a word, even if you've provided context to explain that this is the less common usage of it. So it's important that we that we're constantly making sure that vocab is explained. The final area of vocabulary that learners have challenges in is academic, instructional language and vocabulary related to equipment. This is that language that we would see as educators as typical classroom language, day-to-day language that learners need in order to complete activities or to take part in experiments, for instance. And I've just put some examples of different words there. So general academic words, accurate, demonstrate, conclusion, instruction words, so higher level instruction words: analyze, compare, evaluate. alongside more specific scientific equipment terms. So these are obviously related to photosynthesis. So if you were conducting an investigation, and, you know, ensuring that we have knowledge of all of these words is important for us to be able to understand how to undertake a task, how we need to be completing a task. So without, you know, without learners having knowledge of these instruction words or these general academic words, even approaching a task becomes difficult. So how can we support with teaching and introducing and using all of these different types of vocabulary within science lessons? The first thing I wanted to discuss, because I know it's used quite a lot with learners of EAL, is translations and use of home languaging and use of trans languaging within classrooms. This is something that I'm definitely an advocate of, but I would, you know, definitely say use with caution. What you have to bear in mind is, first of all, are your learners of EAL literate in their home language or home languages? Are they able to read it? Are they able to write in it? If they're not, there is no real point in translating, you know, and spending your time translating large pieces of text, as it's going to be of no use for those learners. It's also important to use it within a wider teaching context, so not just translating individual words. If you are translating individual words, like this example that I put here from one of the science teachers, is then teaching them in a way where they're put into a context. And also trying to use them for pre-learning of parental involvement. So I've seen examples, I've got one on the right hand side there, of multilingual glossaries, where learners were given the vocabulary the lesson before, and they would take it home, they would discuss with parents, carers, whoever it is at home, in multiple different languages. They would write translations and definitions in their home languages, and they would bring that back and use that as a point of reference. So yes, it is incredibly useful to use translations, especially if the learner has studied this topic back in their previous schools. You know, obviously they have that knowledge there, they're just unable to communicate it in English, but do bear in mind that there are some limitations with translations, and we shouldn't be solely relying on them, as given, particularly for our Key Stage 4 students, ultimately they will be taking examinations in English, and they are the ones that have to write in English. We're not able to support them with that. So yes, we need to ensure that there is that expectation that they use their home languages to help support their English language development. Another example of how we can help support with this vocabulary is the effective use of visuals. So as I just mentioned with that translation example, trying to introduce vocabulary that's important for the topic in a context. So rather than, you know, producing a vocab map such as this, or a vocab table that's a simple standalone one, is trying to ensure that this vocabulary, which at times can be quite abstract, into a context. So this is one that I've drawn up here. So you'll notice how I've included this in the process of photosynthesis. I've numbered all of the individual boxes, so the stages of that process, and then the vocabulary, the key vocabulary, is highlighted in a different colour and accompanied with an image alongside it. So not only are you teaching the learners that key vocabulary, you're providing them with a context, an explanation of the process, as well as the visual. Things like graphic organisers like this are really useful for to help consolidate and to help learners remember key information, as opposed to it being standalone vocabulary. Create visual vocab cards and booklets as well for reinforcement. So if you want your learners to consistently reuse that language that you're teaching them within the classroom, it's important for them to know that down in a way that is memorable. So on the Twinkl website, we have EAL vocabulary cards and blank templates. So, you know, I used to use these all the time in my form groups when we were doing word of the week and things like that. And they were great for non-EAL learners. So for EAL learners, they're absolutely fantastic. Put the word in the middle, you then got various boxes around it to provide definitions. These can be edited, so you can add extra sections in them. So you might, for instance, want to put the linked words that I mentioned before, the CCV words. You might want to include an image, and these are a really nice size that can be cut out, and you can attach them to a clip, and learners can take them from lesson to lesson, for instance, if they have various different teachers of science. We also have a magpie journal, an EAL vocab magpie journal. So the idea that you are magpieing language from various lessons, And this is broken up into the different curriculum topics, so maths, English, science, and you can learners can fill it in. And there's a space for them to write it in their home language as well if they feel that that is useful. Alongside that, creating and using word maps for language support. So here we're talking specifically about that academic language, that instructional language, language related to scientific equipment. These are on site at the moment, so are conducting a scientific experiment word map alongside just a general equipment word map that can be placed around the room, laminated, popped on desks, and used as a support, a visual support when teaching your learners of EAL. And finally, encourage the use of different vocabulary forms of opportunity. So this is, as I mentioned before, one of the challenges where a particular word can be used in very different forms. It's important for us as educators to be a good language model and to show learners how they can use that language in lots of different ways, and trying to get them to repeat that key vocabulary over and over and over again. So rather than using pronouns such as it or they, get them to repeat that process or that concept over again. So I put some examples here of how a teacher asking various questions to explain the process of photosynthesis might then use photosynthesize and photosynthetically in their sentences as well, to ensure that the learner is consistently using that language over and over again, understanding how and when to use it, and also demonstrating their knowledge of the concept in general. So another area that I wanted to move on to, that I wanted to have a focus on, is the challenges that our learners of EAL face when it comes to reading longer texts, in particular sentence structure. We know in science that the passive voice is used a lot, particularly when reporting on certain processes or when describing the results of an experiment. And the use of the passive voice is difficult because it reverses that usual subject verb object order that we're really used to when using active voice sentences, which are very common in everyday today language. And this can cause confusion on who is performing the action. And it also, involves complex grammatical structures, past participles, auxiliary verbs, and that can be difficult to grasp for those who are new to learning English, whose home language perhaps has a different grammatical structure to that of the English language. So just some examples I put on there. So photosynthesis is carried out by plants. During photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is absorbed. Light energy is captured by, as opposed to chlorophyll captures light energy. So how can we ensure that passive voice is understood within our science lessons? Firstly, explicit instruction, explain passive voice rules and provide lots of examples for practice. It doesn't have to, they don't have to be long, complicated sentences or really long paragraphs. Simple breakdown of sentences like this are really useful, where you highlight that passive voice and you provide examples of it. In the active voice, I've just put there compare and contrast to show the differences between the active and the passive voice. And allow learners to have a go at transforming sentences from the active voice to the passive voice. Perhaps if you have learners who are going into small group support or who are working with TAs, that could be a focus of a session where they practice transforming sentences from active to passive voice. And then ensure that that, like I mentioned before, being good language models, and that you're demonstrating the passive voice usage and you're guiding learners in applying it. So for instance, if they're providing an oral explanation, that you guide them to use the passive voice correctly, or if they did use the active voice and you want them to use the passive, just correct them and get them to repeat it back to you. Apologies. Another sentence structure or form that is commonly used in science is nominalization. So that's the use of a word that's not typically used as a noun, but is that in the sentence they do use it as a noun, or becomes the start of a noun phrase. So it's a bit easier to explain with examples. So the ones I put on the bottom there, for instance, chlorophyll absorbs light energy to initiate chemical reactions. the absorption of light energy by chlorophyll. So we've transformed the absorb into absorption, so it's become a noun. Oxygen is released as a byproduct during photosynthesis, the release of oxygen. And these are very, very, very common in science. As mentioned, they're abstract concepts. They involve turning verbs or adjectives into nouns. That makes them harder to understand. You know, you need to have a good grasp of the English grammar in order to be able to use these and also produce them. And they often lack context, so it makes them difficult for EAL learners to understand without additional explanation. This all ties in very nicely with what I mentioned before about form and function, and ensuring that we're using this academic language, this complex language, in multiple different ways and multiple different forms. So bearing those challenges in mind, how can we support our learners of EAL with reading? First and foremost, vocabulary preview is super important. So I've discussed how we can look at introducing vocabulary, and pre-teaching vocabulary is really important. That can be done in various different ways. For instance, if you're working with a TA, learners can go into small groups support sessions, and they can learn that vocabulary beforehand and before the lesson. They can take that vocabulary home. They can work with parents and carers to do a bit of additional research and to learn that vocabulary. They can be buddied up with a more knowledgeable other, or someone perhaps who is an English speaker, who is willing to help support the learner, and be introduced to that vocabulary before class. It's ensuring that our EAL learners feel confident with this new language, and they come into the lesson having this knowledge and this understanding of what these words are, what they look like, how they're spelled, if they refer to a certain visual or a certain image, and rather than coming in and being startled by all this new language that they don't understand, and inevitably that results in learners switching off and feeling quite unwelcomed in that environment. Chunking text down, so breaking text into sections, making it easier to understand. If you've got a very, very, very long complex text, perhaps picking out the key information and breaking it down into a much smaller paragraph. Your EAL learners and your non-EAL learners are still studying that same text. They're still getting that same information. It's just been adapted so it's more accessible. In a similar way, text modifications, so staff can modify a longer piece of text if you feel that it isn't relevant to shorten it into a smaller version. You can modify it by using bold, underline, colour coding to highlight key important information, to focus a learner's attention onto what you want them to understand and where that key information is, as well as providing graphic organisers such as concept maps, Venn diagrams, story maps, to help students visualise and organise the information they're reading. I've also put on there about text annotation. This might be more suitable for learners who are more advanced speakers of English, so they can annotate the text as they're working through it. Perhaps you might be reading it out loud, or they may be working with a partner, circling unfamiliar words, writing questions, and you can use that to ascertain how much of the text they understand. You can they monitor their understanding, and it also allows them to actively engage with the text and yourself as well. You can go and help provide additional support and answer questions. So I just put some examples here of various different resources and activities that I've seen from colleagues and on our site as well, so that can help support with reading. So this one on the left is very nice, and I've used this multiple times in various different subjects when supporting learners via EAL. So this is called 2 Before and 2 After. So this is a reading comprehension. For non-EAL learners, you may just give them the image with the blank boxes and they have to fill it in themselves, but for learners of EAL, you can cut these up and use them as cards, and the process they can sequence the process, so the 2 things that happen before this and the 2 things that happen after. It's really quick and easy to pull together, and it can be used in, like I said, in multiple different across multiple different topics. I've put some examples of graphic organisers on there. Like I said, these are really nice for when learners are reading a text. They're able to jot down any key words, any key concepts, any linked ideas. This one on the right hand side here is called the 4 corners. So for instance, if we were teaching about photosynthesis, these 4 boxes in the middle might be filled with, for instance, carbon dioxide, glucose, oxygen, and then sunlight. And from there you can expand and note down any additional information that you've gathered or that you've read about those different things. So for instance, carbon dioxide, you might highlight that it's a gas, you know, whether it's something that is taken in by the plant or released by the plant, and that way that's demonstrating an understanding of the text. And then this one on the bottom here is for those older learners who perhaps are looking at reading explanations, or they're looking at reading model answers taken from GCSE and other exam specifications. So this was a really fabulous example that I saw a science teacher use, where they'd taken the exam question and rather than it being a long answer, they chopped it up into smaller sections, and the learner had to then put it back in the correct order so that it made sense. It makes it less demanding, cognitively demanding. It means they can read each section bit by bit and work through it rather than feeling overwhelmed. And then it also, you know, the fact that they're then able to put it back in the correct order demonstrates that they have an understanding of that key information. So the final area that I'd like to talk about in terms of the challenges is producing scientific writing. So, you know, learners who are well, in particular, who are new to English are going to have difficulty expressing complex scientific concepts accurately. You know, there'll be challenges in learning and then subsequently using specialized scientific language, the scientific norms and conventions. How do we approach writing? We have to write in, you know, a very formal manner. They might need more time to process, translate, revise written work, for instance. Put on here difficulty comprehending specific instruction words used in scientific tasks, and then struggles with English grammar and sentence structure. I approached one of my former colleagues who is a biology teacher, and I said, oh, would you be able to give me some examples of questions that you might ask your classes who are learning about photosynthesis? And these were some examples that he put on there. And, you know, you can clearly see that the length of the question provides difficulty. There's a lot to read on there. You know, you've got difficult language to explain, discuss, describe, alongside additional key topic specific vocabulary, so light energy, the rate of photosynthesis, you know, the process, environmental conditions. So, you know, giving our learners of EAL questions like this can be very, very, very daunting. So how can we support learners in this with scientific writing? The key strategy to use is scaffolding. I imagine that a lot of you here are very aware of what scaffolding is and how important it can be for learners of EAL, but I just want to give you a bit of useful background academic research on this. So Vygotsky coined the term scaffolding and a zone of proximal development. Now the ZPD is the zone that is between this imaginary zone, that what is known by a learner and what is not known. And within this zone, you can provide tailored instruction, scaffolding, guidance, encouragement to help learners move from something that they don't know to what they do know. And you know, this scaffolding often comes from a more knowledgeable other, so it might be a member of staff, an educator, it might be a parent carer, so for instance like the use of the multilingual glossaries, it might be someone that you've budded your learner up within a lesson, who can help support, and it's often seen as guiding a learner towards learning as opposed to providing them with the answers. You're guiding them and you're encouraging them to learn these skills and concepts of understanding. So there's various different ways that we can use scaffolding. Unfortunately, I didn't have any examples taken from my previous teaching of science ones, but I put a couple of ones in from a geography teacher, a geography colleague that I got. So, you know, we can encourage our learners and build their independence in writing by using choice tables, so substitution tables. If anyone hasn't come across those before, I've got an example on the next page, but it's where there's several possible responses to choose from to complete a sentence. So learners pick one from each column in order to write a full sentence. You can match sentence halves, rewrite sentence. You might have to be changing underlined words. Gap fills, close activities, multiple choice. They're fabulous for learners who are early proficiency in English, in the English language learning. Writing sentences based on model answers, providing sentence structure and setting expectations, and yes, providing sentence starters or structure strips. So just some examples here of resources that we have on site and how, just to demonstrate what the scaffolding looks like. We have a conducting a science investigation template for both younger learners, so Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and we have an older learner version as well, a Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 one on site. And these packs contain word mats and sentence starters to help with writing evaluations of science investigations. We also have substitution tables. Now these are the ones, and they're the most basic form, but if you were to create your own, you could make them more relevant to the topic that you're teaching. So the example that you can see here is you've got the different columns and you pick one word or one choice from each one to have it to create a sentence that makes sense. The use of graphic organisers to organise knowledge and information that you can then use as a guide or as a plan for writing, and questions, sentence starters to help guide learners in the direction of what they need to write. We have just released as well on site our new EAL curriculum scaffolding packs for science. So these are packs that contain 10 different resources, teacher guidance alongside 9 other resources that support various skill areas. And they're designed to support your learners of EAL who are immersed in mainstream education. So these learners will have access to the same material and the same content as your non-EAL learners, in a way that's been adapted and made accessible. You'll see, we've got word mats and flashcards, close activities, we've got multilingual glossaries, a whole host of different resources that we can be used to support your learners in various different ways. The first topic that we focused on is space and planets, with the view that we'll be producing many more in the future, based around lots of other topics in science. So, if there is a topic that you think that your learners would benefit from support like this on in science, anything physics, chemistry, biology related, we're more than happy to look at producing something to support learners with that. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about is how do we actually plan for these challenges? I've talked about all of the difficulties that our learners can face within science lessons, but as educators, we are all teachers of EAL, and it's in the teaching standards. It mentions that as educators, we do have to support our learners of EAL within the classroom. So how can we actually integrate this into our planning? I'm very aware, I was a teacher for 7 years, and I'm very aware of that how we are stuck for time, and trying to produce long bits of planning, it is not viable. But I'm hoping to show you something today that won't be quick and easy, and will help you to rethink your approach to lessons, particularly when you've got a number of EAL learners. So Pauline Gibbons is a leading academic in terms of learning to learn in a second language and integrating learners into mainstream curriculum lessons. And she explains that when you're planning for teaching a subject, you need to be aware of certain things. So I've put just a couple of the bullet points here. So recognise spoken language requirements, the listening demands, what reading materials and text you'll need, what grammar aspects are going to be covered, and also essential vocabulary. Her planning framework, I'm going to show you on the next page, aids teachers in seamlessly integrating curriculum content with the language needs of EAL students. We do also have a quality first teaching checklist on site that you can use to help guide your planning and your learning. So again, based on our topic of photosynthesis, I've provided an example of how this planning can be structured. Now, Pauline Gibbons' planning framework involves the 5 grey columns. I actually used to add these additional 2 columns just for extra context when planning, but they're not you don't necessarily need to have them. So columns related to topics, activities, example questions, language functions, language structures, vocab, and additional resources. And in this small table, it's a case of just jotting down what you will be covering in that lesson. So rather than it just being the topic and the activities, you're diving in and you're going a little bit deeper and working out exactly what the language functions are that your learners are going to need to complete. So for instance, in this one, we're describing the process of photosynthesis in a written form, so they're going to need to sequence and describe and explain. Alongside the language structures, so that those grammatical structures that will need to be understood or that learners may need support in writing. So I'll put here the passive voice, ordering words, cause and effect, so because, as a result, comparisons and superlatives, the vocab that you would like learners to include in that piece of writing. So this is probably something that's come at the end of a unit, and the vocab here is what has been covered in the previous lessons. So I've separated that into nouns and then verbs as well. And then just the additional resources that you think may be useful to help support your learners. So I put, additional word mats, whiteboards for jotting down ideas and things like that, bilingual dictionaries, translator pens, iPads for translations if necessary. We feel that they would be useful, visual organisers, templates, and then of course all the additional resources that you've probably created to help support those learners. So things like the sentence structures, or you may have sentence starters or planning tables, so on and so forth. But something like this, it doesn't take long at all to put together, and just like as I mentioned, just diving that little bit deeper and having a look at what it is exactly that you will be studying, and the requirements of that, the language requirements of that, means that you are including your learners of EAL and creating a really inclusive learning environment. A lot of this that I've talked about today is general, quality first teaching practice anyway, and will benefit your learners who are non-learners of EAL. So ensuring that you have this in place benefits everybody in general.